Well, so the conversation yesterday that we had, that we were talking about was, around graphics, interchangeability, some of the elements of that. We were talking about the things that we're going to have to deal with, because we know that you're going to have kind of, textures, mesh model. What are they going to look like, though, when we move from one experience to another? How do we create some kind of semblance of consistency? And where does that onus belong? Okay, I mean, is it on the client side? Is it on the experience on the server side? How do you maintain that integrity of what the artist intended it to be, but also allow the decision-making of the device or of the experience to be put into place, and also make sure that it doesn't disrupt it? So you've got to think of it from a couple of perspectives. One part, user-generated content, right? Probably a little more flexible. And then Nike, branded product. They don't want any kind of permutation of that thing used in the wrong place, in the wrong way. And they want to make sure that there's the possibility of relationships, right? So, if we look at, and as a matter of fact, I had another conversation earlier today where the front side of it as well, we have USD and GLTF and these graphic formats, and they can all work great with it. And I brought up the point that it's wonderful for input and authoring side, but if you expect this, you expect my cell phone that I'm on this experience to compile 100 GLTF files into the format that this phone needs to use, which is probably BC6 or BC7, that's out of the question. It's not even close. And we haven't even talked about the fact that, if you've got a world made of 4K textures, think about that. It's not unreal to have 100 some textures in a world format, right? 100 of them at about 6 megs a piece. It's 600 megs. I wish we all had 5G that worked wonderfully, but we don't. And even in 5 or 10 years, maybe it'll be right. But that kind of bandwidth times hundreds of millions of people is just straight up prohibitive, and somebody's got to pay that bill. That one's not going to come for free either. So now we've got to talk about, how should it land on this device? How should it land on my PC? What's the best way that it should land? How should we get it there? One of the things I proposed was, for one, having kind of like a JSON type file of some sort, or a format that accompanies the product. In other words, I've got animation or a Nike shoe, something that can allow it to be described in some means. Not described exactly what it is, but to say that, I have a mesh and shoelaces are a part of it, and removable inner soles are part of it, and the shoe is part of it that's there. And we want to make sure that the visual fidelity is at least maintained to this degree of what's going to be done, so that it doesn't turn into a Minecraft boot, right, and disrupt that. The logo might be, we don't want the logo moving on the shoe, or maybe we do, or every time I step on it, it squeaks. You're going to need to have something that has those attributes that can be exposed, so that when I go to render it, I know these are the rules of what's in there, or what are part of it. And you want that to be kind of incorporated and signed into it as well, because if not, we have the problem with duplication that was brought up. Remember? That same Nike shoe gets duplicated, but somebody else decides to put a new signature, a new standard inside of it that says that it can be pink, fluffy, and have bunny ears on it. Okay? That can't happen. So there is a certain amount of cryptography that has to be used to secure the integrity of it as well, along with it. So, but how do we do that? What's the best method? How do we make sure that gets actually delivered to the endpoint in a secure manner that doesn't break that? Because I can tell you, the first time Nike comes out as a, fuzzy bunny slipper, that thing's off the market. Okay? Or somebody's going to go after somebody. We're talking about real money here. So that's kind of a starting point, of where I'm trying to go with this is, I think the technical formats themselves are things that are much easier for us to solve, to be quite honest. We can come up with a universal graphic format. We can come up with, the data is all about the same, no matter what. It's not like 5 formats, same damn compression done internally. You know what I mean? There's nothing, except maybe DX, but those are post-compiled ones that wind up on your device. I'm more wondering, or more concerned about how we do this decentralized, how we tag this, how we make sure the attributes are carried along with it. How do we keep the integrity of that thing so that the value of what I bought it at is the same? Could you imagine having a Dead House Sonata sword that becomes a wiffle ball bat by the time it makes it into another experience? How happy is that going to make you feel?
Yeah, there's all kinds of. I guess what you're talking about. Oh, yep. Sorry. Thanks. Yes. I guess at the end of the day, is there going to be a universal trademark language, which almost describes for there's certainly lawyers have done a very good job of keeping themselves employed in creating languages we don't understand to make trademarks. But can that be imprinted into some kind of lexicon where we can go, this trademark can move, it cannot be changed in shape, or it can be applied to this, but not this. I think something like that is the first thing I think of when I think of these problems. Would we want Dead House Sonata associated with diapers? Those are the kind of questions. Some would say yes. Hopefully we would not, but that's just kind of, it's very interesting, and who knows, and that's only for marketing. What about the other things that happen, and when it comes to creating and giving, maybe at some point the baseball bat we would want, and we wouldn't know.
Well, here's the thing. Say somebody has a Dead House Sonata sword, right? And they want that to be a part of their avatar. Because remember, we're talking about interchange. That can be a shoe, or it can be an avatar, could be a relationship, could be earrings, could be anything. And say that sword is something they want to carry around. Well, if they carry that sword around to other experiences and it maintains its fidelity, that's a beautiful marketing thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're walking around, your avatar is carrying around, wow, where did you get that sword? It's a Sonata sword. A what? Where do I get that? We see this in games all the time, right? What is the number one currency? Mounts, swords, anything that's unusual at any kind of large scale. That's stuff that makes you unique. Trust me, you see somebody flying around in WoW in the Ashes of Alar, which is like this giant, floral, fiery bird, right? And it's very rare to get one. But if you see one, you're like, okay, that's pretty cool. Dude, where'd you get that? You know where they got it, but you're still going to ask the dumb question, right? Like, how did you get it? When did you get it? So you got to think about the integrity of what we're talking about in these graphic formats and having that binding. They're very tightly coupled. And there's real dollars moving with the integrity of these things. It has a benefit and it has a fallback. It has a setback to it. Especially when you start talking about in studios. You look at, Disney made a thing where they took the island of Moana, I think it was, and they put it out for everybody to have fun with. And you're not going to make money off it. But there has been, conversations where even studios and people have rich IP, they want to find ways to get the intellectual property out there where people can use them, not monetize off of it, but to be able to use it. It's an active conversation. However, what they don't want is for it to be disrupted or used in an improper manner. Okay? This is the hard conversation. So what's just as important to you at Dead House Sonata is just as important to Disney as DC and DreamWorks and everyone else and every other game.
Yeah, so I think when we're looking at this, right, are we looking at potentially devising a protocol that maybe pairs what was traditionally per game, potentially per object, as opposed to us trying to conceive this at a high level copyright way, right? So you might say that Nike has a series of shoes, right, and they release them, but in order to actually allow for interoperability, right, those shoes stand by themselves, right? The single pair that someone is using. Are we potentially talking about one protocol to describe the assets and how they interop, and then potentially another protocol for actually facilitating trademark and IP related things? And I guess where I'm really trying to get to is this potentially a larger protocol of interoperability composed of smaller ones for things around trademark or things around integrity, and how we actually are then able to verify them within their smaller components.
So it's funny you bring that up, because if we take a look at what's happened in the game industry, we traditionally have assets that are released in different geolocations. And they're the same asset, but they've been licensed under different terms. So the reality is if you could bundle it in one thing, goes against what we've basically been able to put in practice, even though the metaverse theoretically is a global thing that has no place. But should that be, and that ties back into the IP and trademark pieces that I was talking about earlier yesterday, but it's part of what we're going to have to deal with because there's always replication of assets, but they have different rules to be used in different countries, in different places. So do I see them being bound together? I don't necessarily see them bound together. I do see perhaps two separate things because those rules are going to change for UGC as well.
The more we talk about these things, what seems to be happening, in my opinion, is we're looking at a fundamental readjustment on the definition of ownership as we move into Web3 across, ubiquitously across the world. And what I mean by that is, when everyone tries to describe Web3, I often find it's over here, but the one thing that everyone seems to understand is that we're going to give someone ownership. And if we're going to use like our trademark as an example, if we're going to have somehow that you're going to use that trademark, the way that it's done right now, as I understand it, is people are okay across, say, the video game industry and letting someone use your Nike trademark, as long as they don't make money off it. That's not giving any kind of ownership whatsoever.
Right.
And so the questions that I think these things are changing and where I think we're going to see some extremely radical change as we move into these new spaces is our fundamental understanding of ownership must change. And I think it was one of the security guys, I love you guys. So I think you bring very interesting questions. And the word was not ownership. I think it was control or something.
That's right.
Custody?
Custody, maybe custody. And
we call locus of control.
Yeah. Yeah, and
so you put basically both the control, but also there's a limitation of where your control ends. Somewhere you need to end. And so that concept is a very important one, that your control is not unlimited to go everywhere.
Right.
And so
that's a big part of it because these are pieces that have to be tied into, like I said, getting the graphic format. We still tie into the same compression stuff across the board. Okay. How we encapsulate is one thing. What happens to it, the integrity, that's the standard. That's the bigger problem here. Okay. And that's one portion of it. We'll talk about scenes and stuff after that. But I think part of this discussion first has to figure out how custody occurs, how do we prevent some of the duplication, how do we ensure integrity is maintained, and that there is some semblance of decision, not forced action, but semblance of decision. Okay? If you build something from the perspective that I try blocking you by code for doing this, and you get around it, it's more painful, whereas you must intentionally write to disable in your systems. One is torturous interference. The other one can be played off as ignorance. Okay? So by stating inside of a standard that these are the applicable things that you have to adhere to use my asset, to use my graphic, you shift that responsibility. So you have to be thinking in this kind of legal perspective in what your standard's going to be. Because if you're not, you're just throwing graphics all over the place. And trust me, we can do that already today.
Yeah, I want to also maybe just, I think yesterday, one of the sessions, somebody mentioned this too, of sort of porting rules in the real life into code. In real life, all rules are interpreted in a different time scale, in different contexts, and that complexity cannot be captured purely 100% in your code. So we would, if we do it that way, we would either enforce a very draconian laws, right? Or I think the fair use will disappears. I don't think we want to see that. And so there's really one is, the enforcing a rule itself is very difficult, but also the rules in real life are not precise. But once you code it into code, it becomes very strict. And that is a dilemma we also have to face as well.
Yeah, I think kind of compounding on that, right? Maybe it's not programmatic enforcement as it is programmatic identification, right? So in a way, you might be able to beacon back to the trademark owner for potential improper use, right? So you can still ship the same rules that kind of build those guidelines around like, you should do it this way, you should do it this way, but maybe if one of those rules are violated, there's some sort of beacon that notifies like, hey, this particular entity appears to be misusing this particular asset. And I think that gets into a weirder spot, especially when we're considering like identity, like how should we approach enforcement?
Because that becomes surveillance. Sorry. You want it?
Oh, somebody's gonna throw it. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's what they're for.
Yeah. So in these kind of identity solutions, like what you're alluding to, revocation is the hardest part. If you only want to issue stuff and you never want to take it away, it's generally a much, much, much easier problem. And this sort of enforcement stuff in a decentralized environment is very tricky. You typically have to have some root of trust, which in the identity space these days is usually some kind of blockchain, and you have to keep some kind of revocation registry or in sort of to save space, you would usually do this as an accumulator if you are all familiar with what this is. But yeah, this is a hard problem, and you have to have some root of trust, and anything even for sort of, and any kind of digital good, you have to handle this and take care of it.
Even for that purposes, your revocation or your penalty cannot be immediate. It has to be.
Yeah, but it's interesting when you bring it up in that manner with what we're talking about. It's almost like we're trying to use SSL certificates and we're delivering the encrypted payload to the end. And I'm using this example, I'm not saying we're using SSL, but I'm saying that if your endpoints are using a form of encryption that is basically keyed off a chain, and then I deliver assets, I have the ability of revoking you off that chain by invalidating your certificate of use on that object.
Right, but you have to have a root of trust, right?
Yeah, I mean, but that's like how we bind root certs as well on top of.
Absolutely, yeah. You have to have an ICANN, right?
Right, but I'm saying that, and maybe that's a possibility. I'm saying that's the point of this, is to explore, is that worthwhile? Does it become too difficult? Are we just bloating things out?
I would argue that something like this has to exist if you want to have a digital good ecosystem, right? Or some, maybe not one, but there could be multiple systems that would hopefully communicate. But it's going to be very hard to put together a metaverse digitally good ecosystem unless you have a way of handling these revocations, handling these misuse articles, right? I mean,
sure.
Maybe you don't want if you're selling something, you probably wouldn't be happy if someone wore your digital good and then a big shirt with the swastika on it, right?
You mean somebody wearing a Pepsi shirt, holding a Coke and drinking it?
Yeah. Less extreme, but maybe you don't.
It's not unrealistic, right?
Well, maybe you don't ban someone for that. But.
No, but what occurs from it is, because you have at least a registrar, you can identify what the endpoint is at some degree. Because I think if we just look at straight 3D asset conversion and straight 3D asset, think of the number of images on a web page. Okay. Now let's think about the number of 3D objects in a metaverse world. We're talking orders of magnitude. Okay. So what do you do when Mickey Mouse is sitting on the top of my fence post, amongst the other 10,000 things I have in my area, times another million people who have their own little homes and things? That is a ghost in the shell. You can't catch that.
So I'm just thinking about the mathematics and combinatorial explosions from some of the things you just said. So in today's society, when we manufacture a Diet Pepsi, it's very limited on the number of instances by the energy it takes to reproduce this. However, once you start getting into the digital space, you theoretically can see that explode. And just by your website example, so say you have someone who's selling Coke, the drink, and they put themselves beside, in another picture above it, Pepsi, and they'll be like, we don't want to associate ourselves with Pepsi, but the combinatorial explosions get to the point of that is now uncontrollable. The control that large companies have now is going to erode, and there's, the macroeconomics of the digital age, it has to go that way.
Yeah, and this is the important part of that portability. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want to see Stephen King's It holding hands with, Daisy Duck.
Yeah, who knows?
Maybe if it's allowed, right? I don't know. Maybe you're right.
But just think about that just for a second. So how do you stop? You can't stop that, can you? Can you stop this combinatorial explosion?
No,
I think it's impossible.
You can't, and you can't.
That's right.
You can't enforce this with you can have general policies, but you certainly can't have policies down to the individual digital item, right? It's just not feasible.
So that's the key. Where's that line?
So-
Where's that line drawn? Because you ask different people, right? I would ask David that question. He's going to have a different answer for what you just said.
So I would add a little bit of a maybe recap of conversation I had over lunch. And we were thinking about how to implement this, and you were talking about specify things, right? And all that can be done. I believe it's actually scalable enough that can be implemented. However, it's for a very limited scope. So for example, if the scope is just authenticity, so this is not a fake copy, it's a true copy, for example, that can be done. However, if we jump beyond that into behaviors, like I'm putting these two things together, we're totally in a very different domain, and the problem itself that this spec doesn't say anything. You have to reference a higher level of concepts, and the lower level language have no knowledge of. And now you're into a runtime environment. It's like basically a content content moderation problem in steroids, right? And that's much harder to solve. And I think if some current concept and rules goes against that, I don't know the right answer, but I would lean towards that we cannot do this. We will have to find a new concept to stick to. So future, society will come up with a new concept, I think.
I'm curious, David, I'd like to hear your 2 cents on this. So he by the way, David here is from the ASWF, works with studios.
Yeah, I'm the next presenter.
He is.
I'm just checking for my tech
talk.
check. Yes, right. Just stick around. So, well, there's an analogy to this in the movie industry. Like a movie used to be made and distributed in a certain way, and there was all kind of worries about pirating it or copying it, and you couldn't do that. And then in later time, 20 years ago, particularly after Star Wars, fans started to take the movie and recut it at first, and then over time and up to now, fans are doing their own Star Wars things. And at first, Disney or Lucasfilm reacted to this like, no, this is terrible, this is infringing on our movie, that they cannot do that, they don't know what they're doing. But they realized 5 years into it that actually this was good, not all of it, yeah? And they developed their muscles to essentially act, and there are laws and there's everything that they can't really stop the fans from doing anything if they want to. Not all the fans, but they have some weapons. And if it becomes too much, if it's porn stuff or things, they really do have those weapons and they use them. But for general category of fans, they let them do it. And it grew and it became what we know, is everywhere. And that participated in growing their user base. And it became very granular. So in the metaverse, if we think about fully realized 3D worlds and characters and things, then same thing will happen. And the owners of the IP will have the same tools that there are today. It will be better if there is some form of, tracking system for the assets. Yeah. So blockchain and all the promises of that and NFTs to be able to identify where it came from and to assign.
But even in that case, the tracking system they're looking for us statistical. They're not trying to individually track. Right? They're saying, well, in this community, people are abusing it in large numbers, and maybe that's where they pay attention to.
Yes, today in the film industry,
much more
yeah.
practical solvable problem.
Yeah. But here in the metaverse, if there was a way for artists and creators and even and developers to clearly identify a piece of code with the way that you can track the authorship, then you could start selling those things as an individual, which cannot be done today. If you're an artist, you know, you have to go hire yourself in the studio.
That's the more limited problem I was thinking about.
I believe though that we're facing. I believe that we're actually facing though a very similar situation to that right now, which is at GTC, NVIDIA just announced this RTX Remix, which allows you to take game content and effectively their drivers will go make copies of the assets from the game and allow you to create mods. Who owns those assets that were just created? Who owns the IP from that?
Same problem.
Same exact problem.
So people, the character X, you know, from Fortnite, Jones, you know, it's clearly an IP that was created in Fortnite, and Epic Games has the intellectual property on it. It'll be used by this system. It's just like an editing system for games, and Epic Games in that case will decide, you know, this is appropriate behavior, or they'll let it be, right?
Lawyers will decide.
So what?
Lawyers will decide.
Well,
the society, in a way, you can, I mean, the courts always reinterpret copyright law based on the time.
yeah, lawyers are not going away. In
I
the
have a-
metaverse, yes.
Hold on. Let's.
So I'll just give credit to Ori yesterday for this, but Ori asked the question, like, what if I have an AI and I feed it a bunch of Star Wars drones and then tell it to come up with a new drone? What's the IP situation around that?
Yeah, it's an original work.
But we're not in, very quickly, we're not in a if I gave it the AI. RTX Remix exists today.
Or you can feed it into there's AI systems today that'll literally just do it.
I mean, in 2D means happen all the time, and there's a professional tools for them to do that.
I just have a fundamental question. We're talking about one metaverse for the future, or it can be multiple metaverses? Because we're talking about what's okay, what's not okay. What if somebody created a metaverse that Coke can coexist with Pepsi? There's no problem.
But you're talking about an experience, not a metaverse. Metaverse is the collection of all the different experiences.
So you're talking about one metaverse for...
One metaverse that has a lot of it, a Pepsi experience, a Disney experience, all these different places. Think of it like the internet and websites.
Oh, okay, it's the future of the internet you're talking about. Okay.
You see what I mean? So in other words, when we're talking about these, and when we say traverse from experience, that means that when I go into the Call of Duty experience, right, and I get a gun out of that, and I come over into the Dead House Sonata experience, where they're running their metaverse, can I still see that gun? You know, is it in that, and can I take his sword out of there and walk back over to Call of Duty and have it transist between the two? You know, and then the point was that, did I disrupt the intellectual property value from either two going in either direction? You know what I mean? And then his point was, if somebody decided, they said, well, I want to make a cool looking Call of Duty gun that actually got mixed with Dead House Sonata and AI generated, who owns it? Right? Is it an original work of art? Is it owned by the AI? Is it owned by the author of the AI? Is it owned by the person who came up with the concept of the idea?
Yep.
Right? That's a whole nother arena. But no matter what, in all cases, we still have to identify a set of attributes of what will maintain its integrity. We still have to look at how will that move from place to place. The biggest concern that I have, like I've said before, when we're talking about 3D and assets, is really not the format. That's trivial. That's a quick tech thing that we can beat up on 10 ways from Tuesday, but we can arrive at it because it's pretty straightforward. You know, compress, wrapper, standard, congratulations. What happens when money starts changing hands, laws get involved, who owns what, how does it actually impact when it's being moved around? Because that will impact that wrapper of the 3D object. That will impact the standard of encapsulation around it. Because if you detach it from it, the integrity is easily breached. I may as well just make copies of it.
Well, I don't know, Royal. I think as technical people, we have a duty to do better in the interchange and interop of interactive assets. Because today you want to interrupt, you want to transfer something out of Fortnite into anything, and you have to send the geometry over here and the materials over there, and there's no simulation. You know, we were talking about the car example.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a car that you drive in Fortnite, you know, the idea of taking that car, transferring it to GTA Online, and it still works,
Yep.
is fantasy. It's
It
not working.
is, you're right. Every different engine is
so
different.
we have to make that happen.
We
just
do.
No matter what the IP.
So we're making the copy easy.
Yeah, it's, well, because here's the thing. When that car lands in the GPU as a series of vertices, okay, that is the end state at the end of the day. No matter what format I brought it in, it is sitting in that GPU as a series of vertices. You see what I mean?
Yes, well-
And that's where we'll solve the interformat interchangeability. Because like GLTF has a great advantage. It's designed to literally lift the data out and dump it in the GPU. Okay, without you modifying the data, like FBX and all these other different formats. So that's why I put more emphasis in the other. It's not that I don't think it's, you know, not needed. We absolutely have to be able to create these cross formats. And the funny thing is when I say dump it in the GPU, that's what I'm talking about, these end formats, even with textures, you know. Cool, GIF and JPEG and all that good stuff, but no, it's BC6, it's BC7, it's DXT. That's where it lands in the card.
Yeah. Well, how do you author for that? You know,
That's- and that's the
keep
argument.
Transforming the assets over time as you need to.
Yep.
You cannot, you know, when you're so close to the metal or the hardware, as you described, then you become very proprietary to a platform or a particular set of GPUs.
And that's our problem.
Yeah, you want to abstract that. There's, you know, you need to abstract it so that artists can do the thing, and then. You know,
And maintain that integrity.
yeah.
I
So
wonder
that
if
red doesn't look like magenta.
I wonder if to some extent, I mean, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this front, but I wonder if to some extent this interoperability in terms of how it is rendered on a whole lot of different devices could be shortcut by pixel streaming. So you render it once in the cloud and then you stream it to a bunch of different devices in a singular format.
That's kind of like the idea of what I brought up with WAP. Remember I brought that up yesterday when we had 2G and we didn't really have enough bandwidth to pull down full images and full HTML. So we used to use WAP and micro browsers and they kind of did all the conversion for us. That is one place where cloud-based services could be doing that type of conversion to universalize it.
So that
Huh?
that
Dirt's got nothing on it.
so on that topic, right? I think like that actually leads really nicely into my question, and it's kind of like a single word question, and that is distribution ? Right? Like I think we're all assuming that the asset has already gotten on the device. How does the asset get to the device? Especially when we're talking about like transiting these environments and like also being like conscientious of confidentiality, right? Because it's like the easiest way to profile anyone on a network is just watch what they're accessing, right?
Yeah.
So it's like
Marketplace.
Market,
right.
yeah, but
well, but
but
then
who's
you
going to pay
have-
for all that?
Exactly, and
Oh.
that's not cheap.
Well, a marketplace pays for itself very much. You know, look
Right.
at the App Store. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
But I'm saying,
incentivization, right? Like who hosts the infrastructure? And this gets into a really weird spot that I haven't really seen anyone talk about yet. And it's not necessarily for this talk specifically, but like, what is the incentivization for a not big company to run the infrastructure to facilitate this stuff? Are they getting paid akin to like running Bitcoin nodes, right? Like, or is there some other incentivization model? Because otherwise, we're going to get in this weird spot where it's like you're incentivized because you're offering the experience that people are paying for, but if they stop paying for your experience, then you
So-
just shut
Right,
down.
and there's also a hell that could be unleashed by a bunch of microtransactions that an
Right.
ecosystem like that might take, where, you know, if you're licensing assets, you're licensing portions of assets, then, you know, everything is, you know, a cent.
Scale can be a big issue
Yeah.
fast. Well, so let's go back to, like, he had an interesting point he brought up. We only have like a minute or so, but he brought up, you know, stores, right? Content stores where you can go to. However, I go buy the Fortnite skin, right? And I'm here and I go to another experience. Okay, you all see me in my Fortnite skin. You all need to get a copy, but you're not going to that content store to go get it, which means somebody is paying for every single one of you to get a copy of that shirt that I bought. That's a problem, because when I multiply that by millions of people, that doesn't scale and a store won't hold it up, unless the store is going to pay for millions of copies of seeing that asset, which is just not realistic. And so what the real key behind it is something like, say, IPFS or Filecoin, or something that incentivizes people to actually enhance the network of distribution. Okay, that's the driver. Why is it that, blockchain, Bitcoin, all these things, why do they grow? Because people are mining it. They are able to they are incentivized to actually keep growing and building the network. So when we talk about the distribution system, we have to look at a model that incentivizes people to share their bandwidth, to share their peer things, to share that where they actually get some benefit out of it. Because if not, it will be a crippling factor. There's too much for too many copies that need to go out. So in the 2D, 3D space, that's a really important aspect of it that has to come into play. Infrastructure on how somebody putting up for the small company, there's a handful of ways of doing it. I mean, a lot of it will be in cloud. When somebody fires up, somebody wants to do a web page today, it's not like you go downstairs, fire up a copy of Nginx and just, pop up an Apache server. You go on Wix or whatever, you find web hosting space and you go for it. So there'll be some different options and things that have to be done with that. But you're right, it's not in the context of this, but I did want to kind of address it. So we have a lot of work on what we have to do on standardizations, on controls. We'll be able to take a lot of this talk, compile it down into some of the discussions, and kind of carry this forward. But it's never as simple as when you scratch the surface, is it? So when you really start digging into it. So with that said, thank you, everyone.